Hi, everyone. This is acyuta-bhava from Nightlight Astrology. And today I'm joined by my friend Kat from The Creative Introvert. Kat helps me with all my social media, and she gathers the questions that you guys have in the chat box. And then occasionally we get together and do Q&A episodes. You guys all probably know Kat by now. So she is here again with me today, and we're doing a new episode. Kat, thanks for being here. What are we going to talk about?
So today we've got a bit of a technical one. We're talking about conjunctions, combustions, and kazimi. So three C's. Do you want to explain to us what a conjunction is? I think this is the one that most people will have heard of.
Sure. Let me pull up my screen and show an animated view and maybe just demo this. Tell me when you can see it, Kat.
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, perfect. So, let us take a look at a conjunction. Now, a conjunction would happen when two planets come together onto the exact same degree. So let me just do a Moon-Saturn conjunction here. So here's the Moon and Saturn occupying the same degree of the same sign. In ancient astrology, conjunction could be also called a copresence when two planets are in the same sign by whole sign, not necessarily the same degree. But then the actual conjunction of the two planets occurs when they're actually at the same degree. And sometimes also it was called like an adherence. So this is, by and large, the way that it's interpreted is conjunction actually wasn't one of the classical aspects. It had a kind of a separate meaning. The basic idea is that the two planets commingle their significations, that they're blended more or less, that they lose something of their autonomy and they blend together into one symbol. And there was actually, kind of like a sexual connotation to it, sometimes called a bodily union. So there's almost like the two becoming one in a sense. Okay, so that's your conjunction. When a planets come together in a degree-based aspect, and let's say that degree-based aspect is not in the same sign. Sometimes astrologers would also call that a conjunction in ancient astrology, though. So sometimes you have terms that are used interchangeably, but that would be different than two planets coming together in the same house, same sign, same degree. So, yeah, is that clear, Kat?
Yeah, and would that mean different things? So if Moon and Saturn were in the same sign, would you be blending them, or only
Let's
when
just
they're
let me
conjunct
back this
by
up a little
degree?
bit. So let me just go to so right now, for example, if I look at the moon in this chart, you can see that it's trine to the sun by degree, 9 and 9. Can you see that, Kat?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So they're joined in a degree-based aspect. You would not be blending them. You would be talking about one impressing itself upon the other. For example, in this case, the moon is in a superior trine to the sun in the ninth. So it will impress upon the sun with a strong Jupiterian influence, fifth house moon stuff. But it brings it in as a kind of separate, it brings it in as almost like a separate theme or a separate person or a separate event, but they're connected, but there's still room between the two of them. It would be like if I brought, food over to your house. I am not you. I'm bringing food from my house and I'm coming over to yours and I'm enhancing your house and your experience with my food. So that's the kind of image that you get from a degree-based aspect. Whereas if you have Saturn and the moon together in that exact conjunction, it's more like a Saturn moon pie. They're just blended together. That's the gist of it.
Yeah. And how close do they need to be for that blending to happen? Can they just be in the same sign?
Yeah. So typically with aspects or with conjunctions, degree based aspects like the moon sun, or here in this case, the conjunction with the moon Saturn, within 3 degrees is the typical rule in ancient astrology.
Okay, cool. So that's conjunctions. I think that's pretty clear.
Yes. So what were the combustion and kazimi, right?
And yes, and now we're going to go on to should we try combustion?
Yes. Okay. So let's just say, for example, that you have a planet within 15 degrees of the sun. I'm going to back the clock up a little bit so that you can see this. So here we have a couple of planets all really close together with the sun. Can you see that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Whenever a planet is within about 15 degrees of the sun on either side of its degree, it becomes invisible because basically the light of the planet is lost. Its own light is lost when it gets that close to the sun in the zodiac. It's traveling that close with the sun in the zodiac. So then you can't see it any longer. And that's part of a series of steps that planets go through in their synodic cycles with the sun, meaning the long cycle that they take with the sun over a long period of time. Let's say Mercury or Venus, when they're within 15 degrees of the sun, they lose their own light, so they fall under the beams. Then when they get to, maybe within 7 degrees, 6 degrees, 5 degrees, it's said that they're combust or they're burnt up. So not only do they lose their visibility, but then they start being almost like co-opted or taken over by the sun, by the light of the sun. So that combustion process is the planet goes invisible, it loses its own light. In a sense, it's losing its own autonomy, all of which would mean that there's almost like a weakness, or sometimes it's actually looked at as sickness that the planet is going under, a transformative process, but usually some connotation of sickness or weakness, ineffectiveness. So then what happens is, depending on which planet we're talking about and the nature of the cycle, the sun and that planet will conjoin together. Now, that form of, go ahead.
Before we get onto that moment, just a couple of questions about the combustion. So the closer that the planet gets to the sun, are they increasingly getting weaker and weaker? So let's say they're at like 10, 13 degrees away from the sun. They're still technically combust, but are they less combust?
Yeah, that's right. That's the idea, is that, 15 degrees, they sort of fall under the beams. And then as they get under like 8 or 7, right around there, traditional astrologers, they would say that it is now combust, meaning it's burnt up. It's intensifying that state of weakness or ineffectiveness.
And you mentioned this idea of they're almost, if they're weakened, like, it's the sun's will. I mean, and the sun is very much to do with will. So I'm just thinking, are they sort of like going in the direction that the sun wants to go? Is there anything like that in there?
Yeah. For example, recently, let me go back in time and share a story with you. This might really help. So let's go back to when, Venus was under the beams of the sun, right, like here. Can you see that? Mm-hmm. So Venus is under the beams of the sun, really close to the sun, right? So there's about a degree away. This is right around the spring equinox in the northern hemisphere here, 0 Aries moment. So around this time, my wife and I went furniture shopping, and both of us were in this very let's get all of the things that we need as quickly as possible because we've got kids. We have a limited window of time, and we'll just, we're just stampeding to get our stuff. And I caught myself in the midst of this being like, Venus, the goddess of furniture, decor, is being burnt up by the very exalted, very willful sun in Aries. We had to return almost all of those items. Almost all of them. And
you also probably missed some of the Venusian fun of let's take our time and look at all the nice things.
Exactly. And Venus is, of course, debilitated in Aries anyway, but then it's co-opted by the sun. So whatever the sun is up doesn't necessarily mean it's bad, because the sun could be doing something very good, and then it could be bringing those planets in and kind of channeling them. But they're subject to the will of the king, is basically one of the ways that astrologers have talked about it. And that could be bad because the king's will is going to co-opt their own.
That's helpful. Yeah. So I think that's really helpful, because I think when people talk about planets being burnt up, they kind of start talking about it as if it's in its detriment or fall or something. And it's you've kind of just made it sound like, no, there are some little intricate differences there.
Yeah, let me show you another one that is really illustrates it very well. So I had, many of you know, because I shared this, that I had a fan, a YouTube fan, who took their own life. And this was right around the holidays, unfortunately. When that fan started really like losing the plot. You know what I mean? Like really struggling with their mental health. Um, Mercury, God associated with the mind and speech, was combust the sun in Sagittarius. This is just a few days before the winter solstice. You can see that right there.
Mm-hmm.
So it's in a Jupiter ruled sign. Jupiter is in its fall in Capricorn. And this person believed, they were bipolar, I believe is the clinical term. That they started to believe that they were the reincarnation of Jesus. This was right before they took their own life, and they were communicating this with me, and I was trying to reach out to people and try to, see if they could get help. And this was a Mercury that was in its detriment and combust the sun with a dispositor of both, Jupiter in its fall. So kind of like a deluded religious prophet type of thing that this person was struggling with. I mean, I'm trying to be really respectful because obviously he was really ill, and it was really tragic because, I was in contact with some people who were in contact with his parents. And, this is something he had struggled with since he was a little boy. So it was like really, really tragic. But there's an example of, Mercury being caught up with the will of the sun when he had his really big decompensation right before he took his life.
Yeah.
So, that's a really dark example. But let's just say you go to Oprah Winfrey's chart. There's another status that comes in, which is called kazimi. And this, I don't think that kazimi is limited purely to when a planet is exactly conjoined the sun, by the way, and I'll talk about that in a second. But when a planet goes onto the exact same degree of the sun, and some people will say on the same degree, some people will say, within 17 minutes of 1 degree, something like that, or 15 minutes of 1 degree, whatever, that at that point, the planet becomes empowered by the king. It's as though they temporarily, rather than being co-opted by the king, they sort of carry the power of the king. So they become like like supercharged with the sun. Right. And then they have this kind of solar clarity and willfulness about them that could mean something tremendously successful is going to happen. So for example, if I go back to that furniture example, Venus was about to be kazimi with the sun in the furniture example that I gave. When Venus went into the kazimi with the sun, those are the only pieces of furniture that we actually kept from the ordering that we did because it was like 2 days where we went shopping. The stuff that was combust had to go. The couple of items that we got when Venus was kazimi ended up being perfect. So sometimes it's like that. Now, Oprah Winfrey was born with Venus kazimi. So she has that kind of, that Venus is has the power of the emperor. So she's like in that sense, she's like an empress. She has the book club and the magazines and the talk show, and she's got Venus just supercharged with the power of the sun. And that tends to happen kazimi when the planet's right in the sun. Now, the exception that I wanted to talk about is this. Anytime a planet is under the beams of the sun, you could think of it being co-opted by the sun, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. For example, let's just say that you have, Mercury under the beams of the sun in the 7th house. I've had an example of this that comes to my mind where, I've had a woman whose husband was a professor. So, and really, really good at what he did. And so in a sense that Mercury sun, and I believe it was, I want to say it was like Mercury and the sun in like Aquarius or something like that, or I don't remember what it was, but it wasn't like a bad position for Mercury. And so sometimes it's just that the Mercury is going to be co-opted by the sun. So she was married to someone who was quite a successful professor of like language, or he taught language or something like that.
So he was almost using his Mercury for his solar will.
That's right.
Or like the sun was using the Mercury.
That's right. Exactly. And it can be like that. And the context is really important, because just because it's under the beams doesn't mean that there's just like some ruthless sun who's swallowing it up for, ill purposes. But the context will usually tell you. For example, if I had an Aries sun, with a Mars that's combust in the 7th house, I might think about a partner that could be abusive. I feel like there'd be a higher likelihood of that. But it also could mean that the partner is like a really talented, like maybe they're like a really talented athletic coach or something. So I think you have to be a little careful assuming that just because it's combust means it's bad. You have to look at the context.
Especially because, I mean, something that bugs me is that Mercury is combust a lot of the time,
Yeah,
like a lot of the
exactly.
time. So,
Yeah, yeah, Mercury is, but Venus too. Like both Mercury and Venus, because they're synodic cycles, they only go, two signs or one sign away from the sun in their cycles. They're going to have more time in the same sign as the sun. And in those charts, you really need to look at what house it's in and what sign it's in and what aspects are being made, because oftentimes those placements are totally positive. There's nothing wrong with them.
and one of the questions was kind of related to that. What explains the sun Mercury being, Mercury being combust in, and the person gave the examples of Thomas Edison's chart and Wittgenstein's chart. So I guess you'd think strong Mercury people, strong
Yeah.
mind.
And I mean, that's the thing, right? Is that the solar clarity and the solar will doesn't mean it. All that we're just getting notification when it falls under the beams of the sun, that will of the sun will co-opt it. And then, that's there's something about the planet that loses its agency. So it's working on behalf of something bigger. And we just have to know what that means. And does that look promising or does that look a little treacherous? And that's context dependent in my experience. But the other thing to say is that if a planet is combust and also in its own sign or exaltation, that is said to be a condition that it retains its agency a little bit easier than that it might otherwise. So if Mercury is combust, but it's in its own sign as it is right now through this retrograde, I would imagine wouldn't be as tough in terms of Mercury totally losing itself because Mercury is in its own sign. So it's like, how hard, it's a little harder to get co-opted when you're in your own house.
And is there a change that takes place once a planet has met up with the sun and had that moment and got the glory from the
Yeah.
sun?
Yeah, totally. It depends on which, era of astrology you're working with, because the cycle has been sort of sussed out differently by different astrologers at different times. Dimitri George has done a lot with that. And I think recently, I haven't watched it, but I do believe that recently some of my students were saying that they watched an astrology podcast episode where Dimitra unpacked some of the synodic implications of planets with the sun. And she does that in a number of her books too, I believe. So unpacking the whole synodic cycle would be too much for us today. But yes, looking at what happens when a planet conjoins the sun and then moves out as an evening star or a morning star, and those phasal dynamics, I can give you a lot of really nice information. For example, if a person, has an invisible Mercury that was just about to appear as a morning star, it could be that that's someone that's looking to find their voice in this lifetime. They're looking to come out and become more expressive in their communication. If someone is, a morning star that is about to go under the beams again after being in the morning star position, that person might be learning how to be, more subtle or pick up on, maybe step out of the spotlight a little bit and become more introspective or something like. So there's a lot of little information nuggets like that can be found in those cycles.
Yeah, it's nice to remember that the planets, because I think when we look at just a static chart, an image, then we can think that everything's quite like locked and that the planets were always in that place, but actually everything was moving and that matters.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And that's why astrology is so good. It's so good to track astrology every day, because in tracking it every day and in seeing like, oh, this week Venus appears as an evening star, and you can really feel that and then see the stories that, and so, people who watch my channel know that I love to tell stories. Well, that's because if you live an astrological life, there's stories to tell every day. If you're tracking all of these little nuanced movements, it makes life really fun.
Yeah. And even like the random or annoying things become quite fascinating.
Yeah, exactly. It's like the discovery is nonstop.
All right. Thank you, Atisa.
Yeah, well, thank you, Kat, for being here again today. And just a reminder to everybody, my new class, Ancient Astrology for the Modern Mystic, begins coming up here in June. Check it out on my website, nightlightastrology.com. Go to the courses page, first year course in particular, if you want more information about it. There's an early bird payment. You save about $500 off. There's a payment plan. There's need-based tuition. Kat went through my program. Lots of people have gone through it. And I think the thing that I'm most pleased with about the program is the way that it sets up people for a lifelong study in astrology is very grounded and very focused and organized and very clear about why we're doing what we're doing on every level. So hopefully some of you will check it out. If you, like I said, if you have any questions about it, feel free to email me info@nightlightastrology.com, and then make sure you go and check out Kat's work at thecreativeintrovert.com. Kat, thanks for being here, and we'll talk to you all again soon. Take it easy, everyone. Bye.